journalism for me, it wasn't my idea. It was my dad. You can travel around the world to meet all of these people and you can be extremely successful at doing so. I used to think that was boring, but then when I started to attend events, I was only like 17, like with the Birmingham Mail on work experience, free radio, reached out to all the nationals. So I was with Sky for a bit, Box Nation, the Times, the Daily Mirror, the Daily Mail. My first press conference was a Matchroom press conference. I interviewed Eddie. When my first Queensberry press conference was for Fury Klitschko 2. So then when I've interviewed someone like Vladimir Klitschko, which was probably like my 5th interview ever, I was like, Jesus Christ, what do I ask him? So then I was able to just snowball, go to all of the press events when I could while struggling university. Whether you like it or not, Jake Paul's not going to leave the sport anytime soon. The numbers that those guys generate, it's astronomical, it's ridiculous. I love it because I have to prove people wrong, and it's why it comes down to being so driven. Like I have to be the best. I have to feel like I've accomplished my goals in life.
Welcome back to the KultureKast podcast. My guest today is a content executive for one of the biggest boxing channels, Boxing Social. Welcome, Andi Purewal. How are you doing?
I'm good, mate. I'm good. I appreciate obviously the invite onto the podcast. How are you?
I'm not bad. I understand that you do your own as well at Boxing Social, but we'll not get into that yet because what I like to do at the beginning of each podcast is basically just talk about your upbringing, your childhood, the cultural aspect of it as well, given the name of the podcast. So what was baby Andy like?
Baby Andy. Baby Andy was very hyper, very energetic. Used to love I still do love my football. Used to play every day at school. I played on weekends. That was, for as boring as it sounds, that was pretty much it. Like my childhood was running around non-stop, running into things and playing football whenever I could, because that was that was my main sport growing up.
And we were talking just before we started. Obviously, you were a boxing writer for Birmingham Live as well, and obviously now the boxing sort of taken over. And that was going to be one of the questions I was going to ask a bit later on, is what was the primary sport in your life? But it's always been football first.
Yeah, 100%. Football's always been kind of the main passion. Don't get me wrong, it's probably wrong to say that because obviously I love boxing through and through. Like massive boxing fan before being an actual reporter within the sport. But the same way it is for the majority of the country, football's always kind of been the first love for most growing up, and that was always the same case with me.
Yeah, myself included. And I'd say they're the two primary sports in my life growing up as well. But the older I get, I think the more involved in or more interested, should I say, in boxing I've sort of became. Football at the moment is very exciting for myself as a Newcastle fan because I'm from Newcastle. So we'll not get into that because I could get into murky waters with politics and all that stuff. So, but it's exciting times. But growing up, it wasn't exciting. It was always very boring. My Gashley era. So boxing was where all the interest was at, especially from 2010 onwards. Boxing in the UK has been booming, so it was a really, really good interest. What was what is your cultural background like? What was family life like, culture-wise?
So I'm of Sikh heritage. I wasn't really ever I never grew up as I don't know if a hardcore Sikh's the right word, but I wasn't really. I know what you mean. Yeah, you know what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to think of a right terminology to use here, but I wasn't religious through and through. I still go to the temple. I still go to the Gurdwara every now and then, whenever I get the opportunity to. I actually went a couple of days ago, funnily enough. My sister's a bit more on kind of into Sikhism and just following the religion more closely. My grandparents, I'm quite lucky to have both grandparents on both sides of my family who are very much so religious, go to temple every day and what have you. But for me, I was never really kind of brought into that, not necessarily made to, but never really kind of learned more of the heritage, the background of Sikhism and followed the 5Ks, for example.
Yeah, no, I think that it's interesting. Like obviously myself is in a similar position to yourself, is when you're brought up in a different country, obviously you sort of want to assimilate, don't you? So when I was at school and things, especially as I say in Newcastle, it's not maybe as diverse as say. I'm guessing you're from Birmingham, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a bit less diverse, and you want to integrate in things, so you don't always get the opportunity, for example, to sort of enthrall yourself into it because you're too bothered about what your friends at school or something are going to think. And as you say, like football and things like that, it's not exactly the most welcoming sport for brown kids. Hopefully that is changing, and there are young Indian lads coming through at the moment, which is good. But I think we're of a similar age, maybe 15 to 20 years ago. It's probably a different time. Birmingham, though, is quite diverse in that aspect. So I'm guessing there wasn't any troubles of feeling like isolated or anything like that.
Fortunately, not. The schools that I went to were very diverse. There's kids of all different cultures that attended them from primary school, high school, college, and then at university. I've always studied in and around Birmingham, never left the area. So I've been quite fortunate in that sense. And because I've always kind of maintained my main friendship group from school, we've always stayed close. So it's never been I've never felt excluded from certain things that might have been going on, certain events or what have you. It's always been quite good for me in that aspect.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I asked the question to everybody because I feel like I don't want to make it seem like it happens to everybody. So it is good when people say, no, it didn't happen to me, because there are nice places in the world. Do you know what I mean? There are nice communities in the world. It's a shame when it does happen to some people. And often them stories are quite motivational when you see where the person's come from and then where they've got to. But when everything is hunky-dory growing up, you need to hear that side of the story as well. Do you know what I mean? That's why I do ask it to everybody. It's not with like malicious intent to be like, tell me that you got bullied. It's not for that, but it's just basically to say, did you, didn't you? How did it sort of impact you? Because another boxing related person I've interviewed was Jordan Gill, and he's from Chetris. Yeah. And it is a very, very white area. He was saying, but he had no issues, and everybody was white. Everybody was really nice. Everybody around him was predominantly white, but he never felt isolated whatsoever. And then you go to some places which are more diverse, and then some people have got bullied from their area. So you never know. But it is just an interesting sort of point, because obviously everyone does have different experiences. Journalism, we've already sort of talked about it a tiny bit there. And you ended up going to university, as mentioned, got a first class honours in journalism. Very good Indian boy and all that. And when did that spark sort of? When was that the thing that you wanted to do?
So journalism for me it wasn't my idea. It was my dad's. So I remember I was 15. I was just like, you get to choose when back then. I don't know what it's like now. But we was able to choose 3 subjects in school to take on to do for your A levels. For your GCSEs rather. So I'd chosen history, geography, and PE. But I didn't really know what I wanted to do, like moving forwards with my life and my career. And my dad just said to me, "Why not go into journalism? Why not be a reporter? Because if you make it to the top, you can still do everything that I've basically done for this past year. You can travel around the world, and you can still meet all of these people. You can still interview them. You're rubbing shoulders with them, and you can build those relationships still, and you can be extremely successful at doing so." So back then, I actually remember back then, I never had the interest when my dad said it to me. So my original kind of starting point was to make my own blogging website. So I used to just blog on a football match once every couple of weeks, just put out like what happened in the game, just brief, like 300 words, and put it out. And I used to think that was boring. But then when I started to attend events, I was only like 17, and I started doing my own interviews for my own YouTube channel. Started going to do stuff with the Birmingham Mail on work experience, free radio, reached out to all the nationals. So I was with Sky for a bit, did a bit with Box Nation, wrote a little bit with the Times, the Daily Mirror, the Daily Mail, kind of just different aspects, different experiences as much as what I could get whilst being at uni then. And it all just kind of, as I was doing it all, I was starting to realise like just how good it could be if I was to go further. And it all started to snowball. And when I was doing all of that whilst being at university, it just like it all just coincided. So it made university 10 times easier for me. And a lot of my final year projects, I didn't actually have to do anything because it was all already done from my experience of going out into the field.
Do you think that's where maybe some of your fellow graduates or the people that were in your class, so is that where the difference is? Is that you're actually applying what you're doing in the real life world, so it makes it a lot easier, whereas some people might just go on theory first and then as soon as they get the degree might try to start then, whereas you've started like 3-4 years before them.
That was like massive for me. And it's down to my dad. Like my dad pushes me more than anyone, even to this day. Like I could go and look at my phone now and I'll have a message off him telling me, like, you need to start doing this, you need to start doing that. Like he's my biggest fan, but my biggest critic and my biggest kind of supporter, whatever it may be. He wants to see me excel at life and he'll do whatever he can to push me. And when I was at university, he was just saying to me, you need to be getting the experiences because ultimately, and it's for me, it's true what he said. It's just a piece of paper, which every job you apply for will ask for. They'll ask for a degree now. I never actually felt like I learned a great deal at university just because I was actually in the field at that time. So everything which I wanted to do and I was trying to be taught at university, I was actually doing. And I like in my kind of experiences, I always feel like I'm better from a practical standpoint to learn practically than to be learning theoretically, being told what to do. So my advice to anyone would be, if you're at university, go and get as much experience whilst you can now, because it's going to help you. It's going to set up your life after university, because especially at the minute, obviously, with everything that's going on in the world, the pandemic and what have you, there's not a great deal of full-time positions knocking about, and you need to make yourself stand out and make yourself look 10 times better than anybody else who's applying for any job. So that would be my advice to anyone.
100%, 100%. When you started obviously reaching out to everybody and were being proactive, um, what sort of year was this? Because I seen on, I think, I had a bit of a deep dive on your Instagram, obviously in preparation for this. I think the Sky thing was in 2015.
Mm.
So at that point, social media wasn't the juggernaut that it is today. In the past decade, obviously, it's went leaps and bounds. But in the early 2010, sorry, it wasn't obviously as influential as today. It's probably easier for if you were like 15 now, it would be a lot easier for you to start a TikTok, a YouTube, a Twitter, and Instagram Reels, and probably have the same clip posted on every single one of them to build momentum. What did you do then to start instead when technology wasn't as or social media wasn't as prevalent?
So for me to start building into it, so I actually remember, so when my first press conference was a Matchroom press conference. It was in Birmingham. Can't remember what the show was, but it was just an announcement press conference for a show. And back then they used to publicize it all on Twitter. So as much as kind of social media wasn't big, I was quite fortunate that when I started to attend shows, I feel like I just got in at the right time when there was more, not necessarily accessibility, because boxing is a very accessible sport, more so than most sports. But back then it was more so like there was a push to try and get as much coverage as possible, whereas now it naturally happens. So I just saw a post on Twitter, Matchroom press conference. I turned up, I interviewed Eddie, Cal Yafai, Sam Eggington. Matt might have just been it. It might have just been those three. And that was kind of like I was there. So then I built the contact. So obviously spoke to Eddie for the first time, spoke to the Yafais, because I'm from Birmingham as well. So that was the start of my relationship with them. And I've got a great relationship with the Yafai brothers. Then I spoke to the Matchroom PR guy, who at the time still is, it's Anthony Lever, but he now does all this work in the US. And we've got Dan Barnard over here in the UK. Back then, Barnard was with Frank Warren. So again, it was kind of when my first Queensberry press conference was for Fury Klitschko 2. And my uncle took his life in 2013. So it's 9 years ago, 10 years ago this year, I believe, or 2012 rather. So it's 10 years ago this year. And I remember like my dad wasn't in a good place, and he just put a post up on Facebook, and Peter Fury reached out to him, and he said to him, like, come up to the gym, meet me, you'll meet Tyson, Huey. And then like we went up one of the days, met them all. Peter's always been brilliant with me. The Fury family's always been brilliant with me. I can't ever say a bad word about them, especially because of what Peter did for my dad back then. And when the Fury Klitschko 2 fight got announced, my dad just messaged Peter and he said, listen, there's any chance you can just maybe see if you get Andy to come down to the press conference. So he'd arranged for me to get onto the list, rocked up, and spoke to Dan then, who, like I say, was at Queensbury, and then got onto their mailing list. And then I was able to just snowball, build the contacts, go to all of the press events when I could while struggling university. And it just kind of, just went from there.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry to hear about your uncle, but it is a testament to the Fury family of obviously reaching out and being so nice to do that. It is like, as you say, I think at that period of time, it is when sort of they were trying to get boxing back to where it is now. And you can see, I'm obviously heavily biased, and I know that you can't be as a boxer journalist. But for Matchroom, I think they did have like that extended plan from the 2012 Olympics and having them all their medalists and sort of building out their profiles and obviously getting Joshua to the height of that, and obviously building boxing, sort of UK boxing, back to the heights that it is now. But as you say, back then was sort of the early snowball effect of that and trying to build momentum. And I imagine being the younger lad on the block and probably being, no disrespect to older people, but more tech savvy with Twitter and with more like social media and things, that probably played in your advantage in that part. But to rock up to a Matchroom press conference and to rock up to Klitschko and Fury too at a young age, and obviously interview the likes of Eddie, and then what were the nerves like? How much preparation goes into it? How much sort of do you look back and think that kid was so naive? Like, why didn't he do this, that, and the other? Like, what was going through your head now? And if you were to look back and give advice to that kid, what would you give him?
Christ, what wouldn't I say to him? Like, so that, going back to when I was young, I said I was really young, energetic, and what have you. I was so enthusiastic when I started to attend press conferences. When I went to Sky, I was just asking everybody for an interview. Just, I wouldn't say causing havoc, but I wasn't approaching it in the right way. There's better ways to have gone about it. I didn't necessarily prepare for my interviews as much as back then as what I should have done. Now I don't really need to prepare for interviews because I follow the sport day in, day out. There's nothing that I need to necessarily prepare for unless it was something extremely controversial, which I maybe need to just make sure I word things carefully. But looking back then, my first interviews, I remember I was nervous. But when I did my first one, it just kind of snowballed. I was like, oh, it's not that bad. So then I did like 10 minutes with Eddie. And back then, I actually didn't realise kind of how important Eddie was for British boxing, same way that I wouldn't have realised how important Frank Warren was because I was only like 17. So now I look back at it, I think I would have prepared better. I'd have told myself to settle down a bit more, think through what I want to ask, try and be a bit unique back then with my questioning as well, rather than just talking about maybe the show or whatever was the big news in maybe the heavyweights scenario, whatever it would have been back then. But I should remember that so at what would have been Fury Klitschko 2, they had the announcement press conference, but obviously the fight never happened. I remember seeing Tyson was on one stage, and Vladimir was on the other, and everyone was queuing to try to interview Tyson, and there was nobody queuing to interview Vladimir. And I was stood there, and I was thinking, why does nobody want to speak to Vladimir when he's just dominated the heavyweight division for 10 years? He's going to go down as a legend in the sport. So I just went and stood over there. I just said he had somebody, like a PR woman, who was just looking after him, and just said to her, like, I was there just recovering my shows, and she had to get a few minutes. Like, yeah, come up. So I did like a few minutes with him, and I was like, my mouth was dry, I was nervous, and I didn't prepare for it because I went to that event and I wasn't expecting to get any interviews. So then when I've interviewed someone like Vladimir Klitschko, which was probably like my 5th interview ever, I was like, Jesus Christ, what do I ask him? So I was trying to kind of like, I remember I was trying to draw out of him how he was going to approach what would have been the rematch differently to the first fight, but he wasn't really kind of saying much. He was just saying like, you know, have to wait and find out, wait to see what happens. Whereas again, looking back now, I would have told myself like, be prepared no matter what. Just in case you get something with them, you need to be able to draw it out of them. Like if I was to interview Vladimir Klitschko today, I mean, there's a lot of obviously going on in the Ukraine, which probably better to stay away from. Obviously, my thoughts going out to everybody over there. But just on a boxing aspect, I would ask him kind of like, not just how he would approach the Fury fight, but what did he learn from that fight, which he didn't feel like he'd had previously during his career? What were the biggest learning points? You know, when you look at Alexander Usyk now, he's carrying the flag for Ukrainian heavyweight boxing. Does he think that he can be as successful in the division as what Vladimir was? You know, if Alexander was to end up fighting Tyson, what advice would he give him? You know, all these different things which just come to my head now, but I would be better prepared for, and would have advised a younger and more enthusiastic. No, not enthusiastic, because I'm still very enthusiastic now, but just a lot more rash Andy back then.
Yeah, no, I think I know what you're trying to say. It's like you have that much energy, but it's not controlled energy,
Yes.
if that makes sense. Whereas now you probably have the enthusiasm, but you're able to control it and obviously approach situations better, which only obviously comes with experience and having been with Boxing Social for 4-5 years now.
3.5.
Sorry. 3.5, no worries.
The coffee's just gone down the wrong hole. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, and obviously the amount of interviews that you would have done in that time, you'll pick up little things like you said, maybe not asking him about himself because he probably would get defensive and bring the walls up. But if you ask him about a fighter in a similar position to what he was, it's an easier way of basically getting the answer out of him. And that is an interesting question because Alexander Usyk could actually eclipse Vladimir Klitschko's achievements. Maybe even dominance, depending on how long his reign potentially could last. And we'll get onto obviously the boxing scene because I've got a lot of questions for that, depending on how much you can give. Because I know that obviously, I don't know, are you allowed to be impartial? Because that's another question I've got. I know that every interviewer or anyone who's a journalist or in the sport, you will have closer connections to some fighters than others, and I don't think many people can hide their obviously relationships that well over time. And I think you see it like Coogan and Eddie have known each other for way back in the day. There's a reason that you get 1 hour long interviews in Eddie's office, or Michelle from Behind the Gloves being in Fury's room or camp or whatever and interviewing. I've seen pictures of you sitting on Dave Allen's lap. Do you know what I mean? You can't exactly hide that relationship there, but is it hard to not show that sort of not be impartial, if that makes sense?
I feel like it's something I actually do very well now. My image is very important to me because I don't want to ever come across as if I'm something I'm not. I'm just a hardworking, genuine 24-year-old lad who's extremely ambitious and driven and just wants to make the most of his life. And I'm not cocky. I'm not arrogant in the slightest. I just believe in myself and believe in what I can do and that I can be the best. And that's just like all I want to come across. I don't want to start coming across as if I favour one fighter or favour another fighter. It's why I very rarely give opinions on fights. So the example being, I did a podcast when I was in Vegas just before Taylor Ramirez, and I was asking, who do I think is going to win? And I believe Josh would win. I thought it'd be a tough fight, as the scorecards would suggest, but it was wider than what it should have been, rather wider than what the scorecards were. But all it takes is, if I was to start saying, like, Josh is going to clean through Ramirez, or he's going to win comfortably, or this, that, and the other, if Jose was to have seen those comments, he could turn around and then say, if he'd have won, Jose could say, well, I don't want to speak to you. I saw those comments. Like, you saying Josh is going to turn me over. So that's why I always try and stay balanced. I try not to give opinions. Every now and then I do, but I like to think I do it in an appropriate manner. there's nobody in boxing who I've had a bad run-in with, and that's been over fault of my work or maybe an approach I've taken in an interview.
Yeah, it is difficult because, as you say, like people will have their relationships, but it's hard to not burn bridges with others. And I think it is funny watching some interviews though. So like the one that goes in my mind is Coogan for Iowa. Obviously he's got that relationship with Eddie, and Eddie calls him out on it all the time of like, oh, you don't ask anybody else these questions, you don't ask Frank these sort of thing, and it is sort of funny to watch. But yeah, I think you probably summarized it best there, and it's probably back to that experience thing and that controlled enthusiasm is you have to be a bit more calculated to not burn that bridge in the future. Which will be interesting to talk about the boxing landscape a bit later on, because I'll try to get a bit of information from you. Another person who is quite big in the sport for maybe the right reasons, the wrong reasons, is Jake Paul. And I know you did a lot of the boxing social sort of work in Vegas during that time. At Miami, it might have been during his fights. And obviously got the views from all the YouTubers, and obviously he's had a very good month on the platform during them fights. How did you, because you're obviously a younger journalist compared to say the Robs or the Coogans or the Michelles and things, are you more in tune with that audience because you probably grew up watching a bit of YouTube more than perhaps other journalists?
So I'd only watched like brief amounts of them growing up. It wasn't like something which I'd grown up watching. But prior to those shows, I did my research. I looked into every single person who I thought could be there. So I was just understanding of their market, their demographic, and how things would work. And that's where I don't think nobody else did that. I think, me and Ryan, we covered those shows together, but we looked into everything. We made sure we knew who could be there, who couldn't be there, what they do day in, day out, what their audience is like, how many followers they've got. And it's about trying to tap into that. People, listen, whether you like it or not, Jake Paul's not going to leave the sport anytime soon. And he's whatever he wants to achieve, I don't know, but he's bringing eyes to the sport ultimately. And he's bringing us huge numbers, which then reflect across the platform, which brings in a different following, which even if you only have 10 people who say in a Jake Paul fight week, we gain 1,000 new followers, and then only 10 of them end up watching every interview you ever do. That's 10 people who could end up watching an interview with somebody who's only 10-0 and just trying to get to a British title, for example, you don't know. So ultimately, it's still bringing eyes to the sport. And as we've said, the numbers that those guys generate, it's astronomical. It's ridiculous. Just I can't even summarize the figures that we've had whilst covering those shows. And when I'm out there, I feel like because I've built those relationships as well now, like Jake's actually a really nice guy. I can't really say a bad word about him. He's a nice lad. He's only 24 himself. And he knows me now, not necessarily by my name, but he'll see my face and he'll see the mic and he'll recognise me. So I can't really say anything bad about him. And again, it's like I've had good access to him. So it's been, like I say, it's been covering those shows have been different. For example, you'll turn up at this is what's quite funny. You'll turn up at a Jake Paul fight, and you'll have, I say, over 20,000 arena stadium. 15,000 will be in there from the first fight, whereas you're in the UK. Khan Brook, for example, for last weekend, first fight, you had about 500 people in there. Like it's day and night that demographic, because they don't fully understand what to expect and when Jake will come out and what have you. So yeah, I don't even know if I answered your question, but I like to go off on a tangent.
No, I like tangents. When you say that, obviously you research everybody and the potential sort of people who would be coming on. I know, like, obviously a lot of the like side men and things who in the UK obviously massive. Like you said, the numbers they put are astronomical. When you were saying that, obviously, and I imagine most of the questioning you'll be asking in your mind, you're looking for the clickbaity sort of, where can I get the headline from? you know, the reputation that journalists have isn't exactly of the nicest people in the world. It does sound very manipulative. Do you know what I mean? And I can see like a little smile on your face there when I'm bringing up this. And is that something that is specifically just like, we want to get as much from this person as possible? Is that basically the goal?
I think myself and Boxing Social in general are one of few who are not like that, I don't feel like we are clickbaity. I would challenge anybody who was to try to say to me that they feel that we are. If ever there's a moment which something comes across like it is, I don't think it's ever done intentionally. Like with those YouTubers, I never needed to push for a quote or for an amazing title from them because again, their audience, they're gonna watch it no matter what. Like I could have just put, for example, Ethan Payne Bazinga, as he's known on the YouTube world. I could have literally just put his name as the title and he'd have done as many views as what he did for us, because that's just their demographic. Their fans go crazy for any bit of content that they can see of them. So it was one of them. Never really felt like that.
Okay, fair play. I got to ask the question because when
No, that's
I
fair enough. Honestly, mate, ask away.
that the question that I asked is basically the question that I'm referring to. Do you know what I mean? It's like do you go in with that sort of intent? Because you do, as you said before, you're trying to obviously get answers out of boxes, like the Klitschko thing before. You try to get that specific sort of. You go in with the mentality of, this is what I want from this conversation, sort of thing. And it is just interesting to know. So you think, going back to Jake Paul, you think obviously his sort of impact on the sport is going to be a net positive because more people will be viewing the sport in general. And I think obviously we see other fighters have the same impact. Ryan Garcia, for example, is like of a similar demographic. I remember you watch Golden Boy shows from a couple of years ago, and there's more females in the audience on his shows than pretty much any other shows, because that's the demographic it pulls in, and it's a net positive for the sport. When he says he wants to fight Canelo for a title in the next couple of years, is that purely because he's trying to rub the boxing purists the wrong way? Is that basically just because he's trying to get more eyes on the sport and say something ludicrous? Do you think there's any intention behind it?
Because of who he is, I can never tell when you hear those types of comments, whether it's a genuine, like he wants to actually share the ring with him, or if he is purely just trying to kind of continue to build. See, he's Jake's so clever, and he knows even if he says something which annoys people, they're gonna watch him because they want to. If you want to watch him, whether you want to watch him to win or lose, you're going to watch him, and that's the thing. And he's very clever with that. So personally, I'll take those comments with a pinch of salt. I don't actually think he wants to share the ring with the man who many consider to be the best boxer on the planet. But he might actually have a genuine belief inside him that he could one day do it. And I don't imagine that would be registered and sanctioned as an actual boxing bout. It would be more of an exhibition bout. But I think Jake he's acknowledged it himself. He wants to face a genuine boxer now. Obviously, it was going to be Tommy Fury, and then Tommy pulled out. But whoever it is, I think that is the next step for Jake if he's going to continue to push with his boxing careers to face somebody within the sport, because there's only so many kind of MMA fighters you can have crossover, or previously fought other YouTubers. There's only so many of those types of fights you can have until the eyes start to dwindle slightly on you.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's the Floyd Mayweather effect as well, isn't it? Is like, if people will tune in to watch him potentially lose, obviously it never did with Floyd, and that's obviously why he got the big bucks for it. And I think obviously Jake is of that ilk where he does rub people the wrong way because of the controversial comments he says. I have no doubt that he'll be a top-notch kid when you speak to him face to face. But obviously, what he's done to build the profile he has over the years that he's been on social media, it's obviously worked. You know what I mean? They're clever kids. Logan obviously shared the ring with Floyd, and it's not because they're stupid, they're because they play the social media game very very cleverly. But yeah, the impact that he's having on the sport, I would agree, is obviously net positive. And the Amanda Serrano Katie Taylor fight is just one example of that. Like, to his involvement in that to get it to where it is, Madison Square Garden. I think it's the first female bout to headline there ever, and I think both ladies will be having millions in their purse, which is unbelievable. As we sort of talked about Canelo, you've obviously had the pleasure of interviewing him previously as well, and you said many consider him to be the best in the world. At the moment, and this is sort of going into the boxing landscape, but at the moment, do you see him losing to anybody in any of the proposed divisions he may dabble in?
The only fight I think he could lose, and I don't think he'd lose by the way, but I do think he'd beat him. But the only one which I think is a dangerous one is Beterbiev at 175. I think he just is a hard guy, and he can bang, as we've all seen. And I think that's a very dangerous fight for him. I still think Canelo would win, but that is the one which I'm most intrigued by. You know, for me, Beterbiev's a much more difficult fight than if he was to step up to cruiserweight and face Makabu, for example. No disrespect to Makabu, but that's the only kind of one who I see as a potential defeat for Canelo. I think he'd beat Charlo by all accounts. From what I've seen today, he's going to announce that he's going to fight Bivol in May and then the Triple G trilogy in September, which I anticipate. I do see Canelo winning both. I think he'll potentially stop Golovkin late next time. I think Golovkin's aged considerably since they last shared the ring, and Bivol. It's a very interesting fight. It's going to be a tactical fight, but I just think Canelo will gradually break him down.
Is that the thing that you think would beat him, is basically only age and size? So if he goes up too many weight classes and faces somebody considerably larger than him, or if he just ages out towards the end of his career?
No, I think that is it. You see, but he's going to get too old just fighting too long, just trying to build up his legacy beyond already what it is, or he will just face somebody who is just too big, and you know that old saying, "Too big, too strong" for him. And I mean, I wouldn't necessarily even say Beterbiev's too big, too strong, but you just got these iron fists which could knock out anybody if he lands. But again, we've seen Canelo's got a granite chin. But I think that's the only way that Canelo loses. There's nobody in and around those weight classes who can outbox Canelo. If you're going to beat him, you have to be able to try and hurt him and to effectively, in my opinion, stop him. And it's one of them. You know, could Beterbiev be that guy? I don't think anybody else could do that.
Well, that's the thing. The only people that anybody thought would be close was going to be Billy Joe and who was the American fellow again who just recently fought him the last fight.
Plant.
Yeah, Caleb Plant. Sorry, yeah, and both fights went pretty much exactly the same. As early rounds, yeah, probably a bit competitive, and the two did look quite slick, and then it's just that mental fatigue, and I think that's what Bellew and Joshua faced with Usyk as well, as the footwork, and they just couldn't keep up mentally, and then eventually it catches up with you and it drains you of your energy so quickly. And obviously, people who have fought Loma have obviously had a similar thing until Teofimo did. I'm sort of jumping all over the place here, but because we're sort of went into the boxing landscape, but I want to get back into the journalism side of things. For yourself. What is so obviously you've been at Boxing Social for 3.5, 4 years now. What is the future for you? Are you wanting to grow with Boxing Social? I know you said before you had your own platforms, you like other sports as well. What is the future for Andy?
I've always said one day, no matter what, I want to work in football. Being that kid growing up, I'd love to cover the sport. I'd love to report on a West Brom game because that's my team. I'd love to one day. That's not necessarily any time in the near future. I'm very much focused on how things are going now. Things are going, you know, fantastically well for me at the minute. But one day I'd like to just, you know, see that footballing world and how things work and to cover that sport. And eventually on kind of how I would like to do it, I'd love to be a presenter. I've always said I'd love to be on a Sky Sports News or on the Match of the Day, whatever it may be. I'd love to do it. And for as much as people might doubt me, might criticize me, might think that I can't do it, I love it because I have to prove people wrong. And it's why it comes down to being so driven. Like, I have to be the best. I have to feel like I've accomplished my goals in life, and I'll give everything that I can to do that. And even if I fall short, as long as I can, in the end, just say I did everything that I could. I pushed myself to the absolute limit. When I can take peace with that effectively. And if I was to turn around and say that by the time, say I'm 40, 45, and I haven't done that, but I've been traveling the world like I am now, covering the biggest boxing events, I haven't done too badly. So I'm kind of just continuing to push forwards with everything, and one day it will happen.
100%. And I'd love to see it, but I can't make a joke knowing that you're a West Brom fan and say thank you for Steve Bruce departing Newcastle and going to yourselves.
Yeah, mate, what have you done to us, Jesus?
The Steve Bruce effect. And people thought when he was at Newcastle, no, it's not Steve Bruce, it's the club, it's the fans don't like him. And then he goes to Hughes, and I think when he took over, you were fifth, and now
But that's the one thing I will say on that is, don't get me wrong, like, I haven't agreed with Bruce's tactics since he's came in against going slightly off boxing, but it is what it is. I haven't agreed with his tactics since he's came in, but when he came in, when just before Ishmael got sacked, out of the last 20 games, we were 20th in the form table.
right, okay.
So people don't understand, like, from 1 to 10, I actually saw it the other day, from the 1st to the 10th game, we were top of the form table. And then from like 11 to 32, 33, we're 21st. So that's 20 games. We've been absolutely abysmal. So it's not like it's just been like Bruce has come in and it's all gone absolutely up in the air. It's been an ongoing situation which we just haven't resolved. And Steve Bruce, just for me, was not the man to bring in to try and amend and to fix that.
Yeah, 100%. No, I feel like obviously the effect that Eddie Howe's had at Newcastle and the effect that Steve Bruce is having at West Brom clearly states that it was the right decision by Newcastle to do that. It was heavily criticised at the time as well, because I don't know why. I think obviously when it comes to journalism in football, it might be different to boxing, but he seems to have a lot of friends who obviously want to back him, and it was just purely not the right decision. There was a lot of criticism of Newcastle fans for booing him and basically saying that we want him out of the club. And I understand he's a Geordie, he's a Newcastle lad and all that. And I've got like obviously great admiration for him as what he did as a player. And because he's a Geordie, it's like, yeah, well, he's one of us. But when you have the results and sort of the lack of effort that he was having, it's just not, do you know what I mean? And we are passionate fans, so we'll make it known. But again, side tangent and a half. Is the as you said at the beginning, the boxing world is a lot more accessible. You rocked up to a matchroom press conference and was able to get Eddie Hearn to interview on your first attempt. I imagine obviously football, because it is a gigantic sport, it's a economical juggernaut. It's probably a lot more barriers to entry because of that as well.
Yeah, football. So I've obviously dabbled in football. I've interviewed footballers previously on my own YouTube channel, and you can't get the access to them. The clubs don't allow it because any media member who's attending those events, they're paying like to go throughout the season. I don't think that's the case with the Britons, but I could be wrong in saying that, or at least for locals. But obviously Sky are paying to go, BT are paying to go. They're paying for that access to one-on-one interviews, whereas if I'm just doing it online for YouTube, I'm not. So they don't, if I was doing an interview with, say, Jake Livermore, who plays for West Brom, I haven't paid for that. If I was just to see him in, like, say, a Nando's and just ask him for a few minutes, for example, I haven't paid for that. But if I give you a better example, after Brook, he had all the Man City players there. I saw Jack Grealish, and I even tried to play the Birmingham card to him. I said, like, mate, I'm from Birmingham as well. Is there any chance I get a few minutes? And he was apologetic. He said, like, I wish I could, mate, but I can't. I'm not allowed to. And I know it's because the clubs tell him you're not allowed to talk, which is a shame because it's also detrimental to building. They don't need to build their profiles because they're superstars as it is, but it can just help enhance things further and again enhance the sport and the eyes on the sport. But that's, again, I'm not working in football, so I'm sure the clubs, the players would potentially disagree with that, but I've still been able to interview footballers or ex-pros and build certain relationships. I've got stuff which I need to get on top of, and I've got lined up with ex-West Brom players, for example. So there's still ways into it, but that's just kind of a very locked off part to the reporting world.
Is it because of the economical structure? So boxers, for example, because they're their own, they're like self-employed, for example, is probably a good way to use it. They're their own entity. They need to bring their own profile. The more tickets they sell, the better reward they get. Because it's their own interest to build their profile, they go out to get the interviews, which is probably easier. And obviously for the promoters and things, if they're building up a show, they want as many people watching that show. So even if you bring 2 extra eyes on a pay-per-view, at least it's 50 quid coming in. Do you know what I mean? Whereas because football is, well, everyone's just going to watch football. We don't really care because the clubs are getting that much Premier League, especially in the Premier League, with that much money from Sky, BT, Amazon, with these £1 billion packages. They don't really have to do that. And if you have a rogue reporter who does get the wrong wording out of you, it's always going to be the front page of the daily whatever. That's probably the easiest way to summarize it. But I agree with you, it's probably the detriment of the football players, because for so long we don't know these people until they fuck up and then they become inhuman and it's just like a person to attack. Whereas if you do have a sort of relationship with people that you feel like you know them if you listen to them talk for long enough, like a lot of boxers, like Tyson Fury, perfect example. You went through his mental health struggles. A lot of people could relate to that. If footballers had that sort of open-ended conversation with the public, they probably would have a lot more sympathy and fans, I guess.
Well, no, 100%, and I agree with everything you've just said there. And it is simply down to they've just never been exposed to it, because ultimately, especially at that top level, they look at it and think they don't need it. Which again, like I said, don't agree with that, but that's their takes currently. It's unfortunately it is what it is. I don't anticipate it changing anytime soon. But for players, especially young now, without naming the name, I did an interview with somebody who was only 18 at the time, just come through at a team that was Premier League, or still is Premier League. Did the interview, put it out, got a message off him 2 days after. The club saw it and they've asked him to message me to take it down.
Oh shit.
And he was like, it didn't, like, it's no skin off my nose to take it down, but it was no trick questions in there. I was just asking him about kind of his breakthrough with that club, what he was like working under certain managers, and that was about it really. It wasn't like he was slagging anyone off, but it's down to kind of how those clubs and how the football world is restricted in terms of the access that they give.
Yeah, it's probably because there's so much money and so big contracts going with a select few that anybody else taking even a slice of, even if you got normal questions, but there's a slither of an exclusive that could have went to Sky or BT, then obviously he's treading on somebody else's toes, but financially, and it is a shame because I feel like a lot of footballers would have unbelievable stories, because most of them, when they do retire and open up a bit more, you hear the shit they go through during their career that you never hear about. You'd see them in a completely different light. The Wayne Rooney documentary, for example, on Amazon, and you don't realize that he's not told anybody about I think it was a groin tear during the 04 Euros, I think it was, and they showed the clip to Sven-Göran Eriksson as well, and he was like, what? You didn't even tell me that, and I'm the manager. But
it's exactly true what you say. Like, all these things you don't find out about until the end of their careers, and that's what, again, if you used to learn all of these things, you maybe make you, say if they're performing badly on the pitch, but they've got personal problems going on, it would allow you then reconsider maybe being a bit too harsh on their performances and what have you. And it would also, men naturally, a lot of them, and myself included, I'm very much so like, get on with it. That's my dad's drilled it into me, like, get on with it. Any issues you've got, just get on with it. And I've kind of gone away from that now and been a lot more open with anything that's gone on in my life. But for footballers, it's very much like they have to bottle it all up because they don't have that release. And, you know, you hear stories all the time of just things which come out. And, you know, when you unfortunately hear about footballers who have taken their lives and what have you, and it can just come down to the stress of the sport, the stress of the expectation and the pressures on them when they hit that rut of depression, unfortunately. And the only way you can get out of it is to talk more and to, when you hear about it in an interview when they've retired, it's not the time that you'd like to have seen them receive that support, to have opened up. You'd like it to have happened during their career.
Exactly.
But it's a game that's like, that's not even with regards to interviews or anything. That should just be happening internally with the clubs. But it's another topic.
Yeah, no, well, mental health in general, to be fair, is obviously a lot more prevalent than it was previously. I'm not saying that, sorry, prevalent's probably not the right word. It's a lot more openly discussed. I'm sure that it was happening back in the day, but as we say, it was more just that head down and get on sort of thing. But yeah, it is an awkward one because you see the attention that they get is so high, and then even coming out of the sport, and you see it in any sport, boxing similar, when they come out of the sport, it's very difficult. I think there was a few academy kids within the past couple of years when they got released, they obviously committed suicide because they're getting promised, you know, you're going to be the next Ronaldo, Messi, or whatever it may be, and you're getting that much sort of adulation within an academy structure, and then, oh, you're not good enough for the first team, see you later. And then your world comes crumbling down, sort of thing. And it's horrible to see. I think since then, a couple of news reports of them kids have came out, I think more things have been put in place, which is obviously is very good. There is one Premier League player who's got a podcast that I know of. There might be more, but there's Ben Foster, the goalkeeper, and the stories that he comes out of, and it's what we're saying, isn't it? It's he's one of the coolest sort of footballers, and he's a goalkeeper, which nobody really likes, let's be honest. Yeah, nobody really gives a shit about goalkeepers. Yeah, he's not a striker, but he's one of the more well-received ones because he's the only one talking and saying, this is my experience with Salah. I went up to him afterwards and tried to get his shirt or on this game. And I think when he was in the Championship, he had his GoPro in the goal, and yeah, he wasn't allowed to do it because of the money in the Premier League and all the sponsorship deals and things. But it's a crazy world. It is actually a crazy world, the football world.
No, 100%. And it's again, like, you know, you just mentioned Ben Foster, ex-West Brom player as well.
Yeah.
He's literally the only one you can think of who's a current pro who does anything like that. And it's great to hear his stories, but it's, again, you can imagine it's something he probably wanted to do 5-6 years ago. Not, he must be like 38, 39 now. So even then, he's coming towards the end of what has been a long career for himself. And I just think it would help people. And you know, you're mentioning these youngsters who get released and the promise the world. A lot of them, like West Brom, lose a lot of youngsters to your Man United, your Man Cities, your Chelseas, your Liverpools, more than people will know. We've got like an unbelievable academy, but I've been told of the salaries that we offer, which will be 20, 30 times less than what one of those teams will offer. So that just kind of gives you an indication when somebody's 16, 17, they get their head turned. They'll take the money immediately. They'll go to this top club on a 2-year contract. They'll be thinking, I'm top of the world. I'll go and achieve my goals. And then 2 years down the line, they'll turn 19, 20, get released. And because they haven't been playing, they'll end up in the Conference or League Two trying to build their way back up, earning a fraction of what there was on them. And because they weren't smart with that large amount of money, it's almost like they're starting from ground zero again, like from breaking point, from zero. And it all just kind of impacts their mental health because you're looking at yourself as a potential future star earning that big £400,000-500,000 a week to all of a sudden picking up maybe £500,000-600,000 a week instead of £500,000, and it impacts you. And again, going back to how it links in with boxing, you know, boxers are, as you said, they're self-employed. You know, unless you're an Anthony Joshua or you're a Tyson Fury, most of them will do those interviews regularly because they know how important it can be just to continue to promote themselves. And the more followers they have, the more tickets they sell, the bigger a purse that they can then demand.
Well, that's exactly it. And and you see so many wonder kids. You probably see more wonder kids fail than you do succeed, unfortunately, and it's because of that financial aspect. And even I imagine when Tyson and Joshua were coming up, they would have been doing the rounds, and well, they did do the rounds on the interviews. It's when you get to that certain point where you don't have to, obviously, because you've established your audience, you've already put in the hard yards, as it was. But yeah, no, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I ended up speaking a lot more about football than I actually thought I would initially. Came in with boxing, but as I say, I love football. But yeah, as I say, I want to sort of recap a tiny bit through the boxing landscape at the moment. Just a couple of the divisions that I personally like. Get your thoughts as best that you can give them while remaining impartial. Lightweight division is probably one of my favorite divisions, other than heavyweight, because it's just so fucking exciting. You've got Loma, you've got Kambosos now, you've got obviously Devin Haney, Ryan Garcia. All of them essentially are in that sort of mix. Respectfully, from your position, with remaining impartial, or however you want to word it, who do you think's the king of the hill?
Currently, it's Kambosos. Currently, he's got the titles. He beat the man who beat the man. He's number one. Do I think he beats everyone in that division? No, but he's number one at the minute. I think Tank's the best at 135.
Okay.
But Kambosos is, without shadow, with the titles, he's number one. Whether you class him as undisputed or not because of the whole WBC situation doesn't make a difference to me. But because he beat the man who beat the man, he's number one currently.
First, I personally like Devin Haney out of that crop, to be fair. Just a bit of a fan of his.
Do you think he's number one in the division?
I think he could beat Kambosos, which would make
But
him
do you
number
think
one.
he's currently number one?
Well, I'd have to agree with you. The person who's got the majority of the belts is number one. But saying that, okay, we skip up a couple of weight divisions to heavyweight. With that logic, Usyk is number one, which I think most people would disagree with.
But Usyk never beat the man who beat the man. Usyk beat AJ, who'd already had that loss to Ruiz. And also, AJ's not been the same since that defeat to Andy Ruiz. You know, I've had this conversation with many people. He needs to get back to that, not aggressive he was never aggressive or reckless, but he broke his opponents down and he was a brilliant 3-4 punch combination fighter. But now when you watch him, he looks too worried about what's coming back at him. And that's what he needs to get over mentally. If he can get past that, if he can work past that, he can then get back to, he can beat Usyk. All he's got to do is come in heavier, use his weight more, be a bit more aggressive, but be clever with it. And he can beat him. And he nobody's tested Usyk's chin yet.
Mm-hmm.
Test his chin, see what he's going to hold up like at heavyweight. Ultimately, Fury beat Klitschko, and then he beat Wilder, 2 wins and a draw, but everyone will say beat him 3 times, and I'm no difference. Fury's the man in the division because of who he's fought, who he's overcome. With the great respect, I know AJ's got a very good CV with the guys he's fought, but also none of them have been considered number one in the division when he fought them. You know, Fury beat Klitschko when he was number one. Fury went to America 3 times to beat Deontay Wilder. Obviously, again, 1 was a draw, but as we said earlier, AJ fought, I can't name them in order. I thought Parker win was a good win, but wasn't at his best. Wasn't an impressive performance from him. Ruiz lost and then beat him from just outboxing him, but Ruiz came in heavy and never looked interested in even winning that rematch. Povetkin wasn't the fighter that he once was. Granted, he's caused the upset with Dillian since then, but again, look at what happened in their rematch. Pulev, I think he should have stopped Pulev in the 3rd or 4th round. You know, when Pulev turned his back on AJ should have stopped him then. For that was it 9th round? I think he stopped him in. Shouldn't have really got to that point, but I do again think that comes down to kind of AJ being just a bit wary of what's coming back at him, even though he was dominating that fight. I just think that's something for him to come over.
I think from the interviews that I've heard after this Usyk fight, the only one or two that he's done, I think he obviously acknowledges that as well, because most people in the boxing world said wrong game plan. You don't try to outbox one of the best boxers. You use your physical advantages over him. Yeah, I think, like you said, Fury's the man to beat, isn't he? He's king of the hill at the moment, and I think he knows that as well. Obviously the way that he's going on at the moment is calling everyone a dosser left, right, and centre. He definitely knows it.
No, 100%. And listen, fair play to him. Like, he's gone and he's, like we said, he beat Klitschko, and he was out of the sport for 3 years. He's come back and then beat the most dangerous puncher in the sport conclusively on 3 occasions. Again, one was a draw, but yeah, fair play to him. And obviously going into this Dillian fight, I ultimately think that he'll fight Dillian, he'll beat Dillian, and then hopefully we see an undisputed bout, whether it's Fury AJ or it's Fury Usyk. Hopefully that happens, and after that, I think he'll either retire, or if say Usyk beats AJ a second time, I think AJ and Dillian White will fight, whilst Fury Usyk fight, and then if AJ beat Dillian, then I think he'd fight AJ then. But if Dillian beat AJ, I think Fury would retire then. And I don't think anyone could begrudge him of that, because if he fought Usyk and became undisputed, what left is there for him? You know, what would be the point of him fighting AJ if AJ was to lose to Dillian?
True. Is there any other weight categories that interest you, your particular favourites?
Obviously, I love the welterweight division. Like most, there's so many great fighters in that division that could end up facing each other. You hope that there's no kind of issues in terms of a cross-promotional standpoint. I love the lower weights as well, because the lower weights they just love a bit of a ruck, they love a war, and there's so many great fighters there who unfortunately they don't get the recognition they deserve because of the weights that they're fighting at. But yeah, like most, I'm very much, as you said, lightweights, welterweights, and then the heavies, because the heavies, just anything can happen in that division. But then I love light heavyweight as well. I think there's some great fights that could be made there. Callum Smith moving up to light heavyweight's an interesting one. We saw him with that knockout versus Castillo, which for a few moments after was scary to obviously be seeing what was happening to him. Thankfully, I don't know, touch wood, obviously everything's okay now. Back then we found out he was, so hopefully he's had no issues since. But yeah, like, it is those ones that I've just named.
How analytically do you watch boxing? Because I know before you said that you would love to get into presenting and punditry of football. Would that ever interest you in boxing, or is it mainly the journalist? Like, it's pretty much the same thing. A journalist is basically just conveying information, and a pundit is doing the same thing, but different sort of topics. Does that side of things interest you as well in boxing, or is that more just for football?
What, in terms of like breaking down the fight and explaining what fighters would like? I do that myself every fight, but I always just kind of stick to the questions rather than starting to break down fights, because you just don't have enough time. Don't get me wrong, I still do interviews if I do one with Frank Warren or with Eddie Hearn, I'll say to them, what did you think of this or that? Was that an issue? Small things like I've just said to you, like with AJ, his best was when he was throwing those 3-4 punch combinations. He's a brilliant combination punch fighter, and he's got such a great variety of punches that he throws, but we haven't seen it since Klitschko. We haven't seen that. I think the Klitschko fight, you could argue, took
he adopted his style. He adopted Klitschko's style after the Klitschko fight, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that wasn't the way forward for him. He had success from his own style pre-Klitschko, and he didn't need to start changing things. Fair enough to him. He wants to improve. He wants to learn all the time. Everybody's the same. Nobody should be any different. But if it isn't broke, why fix it? And for him now, if he gets back to that, if he beats Usyk, he's got a better chance of beating Fury then. I still think Tyson would win, but that's like a much more interesting fight. Whereas if he was to lose to Usyk again, I just wouldn't give AJ a chance with Tyson. And that's no disrespect to AJ, but he's coming on 3 defeats in his career then. He's taken some heavy shots during his career as well. Dillian wobbled him. Povetkin wobbled him, Klitschko dropped him. Like, it starts to take its toll.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. But again, I really thank you for your time today. Just before we wrap up, I usually ask each guest the same 5 questions, just sort of like a quick fire question sort of thing. So we'll crack on with them. How do people want to follow you? Instagram, Twitter, where are you most active?
I'm relatively active, more so on Twitter, but all of my handles are the same: Andi Purewal, ANDIPUREWAL.
Awesome. And the first of the quickfire questions is, what are you most proud of?
Oh, it's not quick fire, man. That's a difficult question, because I don't ever look at, like, when I look at what I've done, I think I've achieved like 1% of what I want to do with my life. So, but then I look at last year, like, I've had like a lifetime of memories last year, traveling to and from the UK and America, covering the biggest shows. You know, that's something I'm really proud of, because I did it on my own. I'm proud of getting a first at university. It would be one of those two, yeah.
What are you most looking forward to?
Just looking on a selfish standpoint, just looking forward to seeing how my career unfolds in the coming years. I think there's it's an exciting time ahead for me, and I'm just looking forward to seeing how everything goes for the next few years.
What's your biggest motivation?
For as cheesy as it sounds, it's my family. Like, I want to do it for them. Like, I want to be successful for them. Like, my dad's pushed me beyond anything I could ever explain. So I'd love to just one day be able to be like, there's a house, Dad, there's the keys. Enjoy it. You know, you don't need to worry about anything. Like, my family, yeah.
Not cheesy at all, mate. It's I think most people would love to be in that situation and aspire to be in that situation. What is your definition of success? I think you might have just answered it, but if
just being able to say you've got no regrets. I think that's just success in itself. To be able to know that you gave everything to be the best that you can be, then for me, you're a success.
smashed it. And last but not least, because it's the KultureKast podcast, how do you think your culture has impacted you in your journey thus far? And when I say culture, I mean everything that we've talked about in this podcast: your upbringing, your background, all the influences, inspirations that have shaped you to be who you are today.
Wouldn't I really know how to answer that one, mate? Blimey.
Well, you're a journalist. You can whip up an answer eloquently.
I've got something to say now. I don't know. I think culturally, especially as things have started to build, I've seen more people of the same background as myself, more Sikhs starting to kind of follow me and push me and wanting to see me do well, which has been really nice. But I don't really know. I wouldn't know how to answer that. I don't know how to kind of mesh it all into one.
That is the answer. Yeah, that is the answer. Fair play. And as I say, I really appreciate the time, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. And links and things to follow yourself will be in the link in the description. Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, all of that banter. And any last words, or we all good?
No, listen, thanks for inviting me on that. I've enjoyed it. It's been good to talk boxing and football outside of me doing an interview with somebody. It's nice to not need to be thinking about questions off the top of my head for a change. But I've enjoyed it, so thank you for having me on, mate. I've had a good time. I hope you have too.